our next speaker authored more than 15 books and 400 articles. He invented rainforest marketing, which was one of the first fair trade eco-labels in the United States. He has taught at Harvard and Yale, worked on a family farm, and also for the US Department of Agriculture. Currently, he leads the market transformation work of World Wildlife Funds for agriculture, aquaculture, business and industry, finance, fisheries, and forests. It's an honor for me to welcome Dr. Jason Clay.
So I want to take Eric's presentation and run some of the same data through a slightly different lens. The Oromo of Ethiopia have a saying that goes, "You can't wake a person who's pretending to sleep." In the conservation world, we've been winning some battles and losing the war. We have to wake up and change the way we think. The issue is pretty simple, really. If we don't get where and how we produce food right, we can turn out the lights and go home. The conservation of biodiversity on this planet is not going to be possible. But building fences around biodiversity and ecosystems won't work either. If it comes down to a choice between a tree and a child, the child's going to win every time. We've got to feed people on this planet. We don't buy or sell anything. We don't make laws, we don't make regulations. So how do we influence, how do we leverage those who do? We think, and to pick up on just this last question, it's about creating awareness that's science-based. Today, one of the problems is we have 7 billion experts on food. We've got to figure out how to address that issue. Let's do it through science, acknowledging that people interpret science differently, and there's lots of science, and one thing about science is you get a lot of outliers in order to try to get to the truth. And in an age where you can basically pretty much find any peer-reviewed article to say anything you want to say about anything, it's not just a question of science either. From awareness, then, we need to build consensus. How do we work on this planet to manage it, to produce for everybody on the planet, and to try to maintain biodiversity on the planet? Consensus is built across sectors, not within them. Consensus is about bringing many people under the tent, with a goal of bringing most people under the tent, realizing that there are going to be outliers on either side. And once there's consensus, we can begin to focus on strategies and be very strategic about interventions. Without this, I don't think we're going to actually be able to change the current trends in how people think about this. Here's the challenge. In the next 40 years, we have to produce as much food as we have in the last 8,000. And actually, it's only 37 years now. We can't get away from the basic fact that population times consumption has got to equal the carrying capacity of the planet. Today, we're exceeding it. Our work shows that we're living at about 1.5 planets. We come to the end of the renewability of the resources we use in August this last year. We've got to figure out how to produce more and get back within the planetary boundaries. Let me just put this in a slightly different way. If you have 7 billion people and they consume 1 unit's worth of consumption each, that's 7 billion units of consumption. We're projected to have at least 9 billion people by 2050. They're going to consume twice as much per capita as we do today. That's 18 billion units of consumption. It's not a straight line. It's increasing. To remain with the current impacts that we have in water, land, soil erosion, etc., we need to increase the efficiency of production by 60% of each of those units of production to stay where we are today, to tread water in the next 37 years. If we want to get back within the boundaries of the planet, we need to improve by about 75 to 80%. That's the challenge. That's what we're going to have to figure out how to do. The biggest threat to life on Earth as we know it is food production, food and fiber, agriculture, livestock, etc. We've heard about some of these trends, but let's put it in a slightly different perspective. The end of population growth is in sight. By 2050, it's going to increase 25 to 30%. And then it's pretty much going to table off according to most experts. The problem is income is going to increase by 2.9 times, 190% by 2050. And that's going to lead to a doubling of consumption. So the issue isn't really just about population. It's about how much income people have to spend and what they're going to buy with it. And the first thing people coming out of poverty buy when they have more income is more food and better food, and they start eating up the food chain. In particular, they eat animal protein. We also have this issue where by 2050, 70% of people on the planet are going to be living in cities. And that's equal to all the people that live on the planet today. And I'm confident we can produce nutrients in cities. We can produce leafy greens. We might be able to produce some fruits and vegetables. We may be able to do some aquaculture. But we're not going to produce cereal grains in cities, except maybe Detroit, where we've got a few acres that we could plow. But generally, cities are not going to be about producing food, at least most of the diets. I also want to just talk a little bit about the speed of change, or the speed of life today. In the Industrial Revolution, it took the UK 155 years to double the GDP of 9 million people. It took China 12 years to double the GDP of 1 billion people. That's how fast things are changing. And in that 12 years, China lifted 400 million people out of poverty. And since then, they've lifted another 250 million people out of poverty. And that is a good thing. That's what governments should be trying to do, is helping lift people out of poverty. But it has huge implications when people with more income spend more of it on food, and different kinds of food at that. The speed of life today has picked up. We're designing solutions for here when the world has moved to here. Business plans need to be revisited every 8, 10, 12 months, not every 3 to 5 years. That's a very different way of thinking. China has a program to bring 250 million people out of rural areas into cities because they will have a better way of life. Their children will get educations that are fit for purpose in the 21st century. That is a huge kind of social engineering. That's the kind of thing that we're going to probably see more of, but it's also going to mean that we need to produce more food to feed all these people moving into cities. China's commitment, though, is not insignificant. It's half of their farmers. It's 10%, maybe 8% of the world's farms. These are not insignificant numbers. This is as important as their one-child policy. And it doesn't stop with China. China's growth is the engine that's pulling the world. Everybody knows about the global recession, right? Somebody ought to tell these 100 countries there was a recession, because they all were growing at 5% or more between in the 2010-2011 period. Half of them, more than 50, were growing at 7% or more. This is 60% of the world's population, these blue countries. The recession was in Europe and a little bit in the US. The world kept on growing. And we got to get used to the fact that we don't dominate global economics the way we used to. And therefore the solutions need to be slightly different. And this is the relationship of China to the growth in these countries. We heard a bit about commodity prices. Jeremy Grantham, who puts out GMO newsletter out of Boston, he manages Harvard's endowment, or at least part of it, and is generally considered the person that you want to benchmark again, has basically said resource scarcity is here to stay. In fact, The single most scarce resource on the planet are renewable resources, fish, trees, and anything that grows in soil. That pretty much takes care of food. We've got to figure out ways to produce more from less. And instead of trying to maximize one thing like production or income, we've got to figure out how to optimize several things. We can't afford a single solution strategy. We've got to look at the complicated web of things, not hundreds of things, but a few things. We've got to make production more efficient, and we've got to intensify. That's going to be key. How do we double production without increasing the amount of land used? How do we double the water efficiency that we have? And the real issue is which production systems today do we have that can do this? Conventional agriculture, no-till agriculture, organic agriculture, agroforestry, large scale, small scale. People outside of these areas, how do we really begin to intensify? Which of these systems can double? Which of these systems can double down? This is a science issue. This is a practice measurement issue. We've got to get metrics so that we can begin to see progress. You manage what you measure, so what do we need to measure? We can't focus on 100 things or 1,000 things, and we can't afford to focus just on one thing. So what are we going to actually focus on? We've got to be strategic, and the issue isn't what to think. There are good studies today that show that 80% of what students learn in college will be obsolete before they graduate. The issue isn't what to think, the issue is how to think. If you learn how to think, you can keep solving problems as they come your way. And we need to begin to focus on that. So if we care about greenhouse gases, where do you intervene in the food system to affect greenhouse gases? Is it processing? Is it transportation? No, it's in primary production. That's where the biggest greenhouse gas impacts are for all of the food groups that we have. 14 crops provide 75% plus or minus of all the calories consumed on the planet. And these are all crops, none of these are animals. 2 crops provide about 50%. Only 2 of these crops are going to double production by 2050 in terms of the genetic gains that we're seeing. That's sugar beets and cottonseed. Makes for a great diet. The question is, what's going to happen when animal protein begins to move from 10% of global calories to 20%? And what's the impact going to be on the calories available for people? Beef is kind of the poster child for the complications of what it's going to take to intensify production. Today, beef production takes about 60% of the land and produces 1.3% of the calories. And you might say that maybe we use as much as twice that amount for the actual nutrients that we get from beef. But still, can we figure out ways to use half as much land and produce twice as many nutrients as we do today? That's going to be the challenge moving forward. Thank you. Food security is national security. 3 years ago, Russia, and I have found that it's better not to talk about climate change, let's just call it weather variability. Russia experienced weather variability. Wheat production went down, the country closed its exports of wheat, and within 3 months, you had a person set themselves on fire in Tunisia because of the price of bread. You had dock worker strikes in Egypt, and you had middle-class strikes in Algeria over food prices. Weather variability led to the Arab Spring. It wasn't the only thing, but it was the spark that created it. Today we have a global system where 8 countries provide 85 to 90% of the cereal grains that are exported. These same 8 countries provide 65 to 70% of the oil seeds that are exported. Comparative advantage is great. It lets us produce things where we can produce them better and ship them to places that have either temporary or chronic shortages of food. The question is, what happens to our system when we actually have 4 of those 8 countries that have a drought, as in 2012? Or when India and China need to actually import more food because they specifically have a drought and their populations represent such a huge chunk of consumers on the planet. Just when we need global trade to help us kind of level out discrepancies in food production versus consumption globally, we find that we have been unable to address trade barriers. In fact, trade barriers for food and food items are greater than any other sector on the planet. So we're going to have to figure out how to address that. And as was pointed out, although it's clear I need to update this slide a bit, the price of food in places like the United States, the amount of money that's spent on food as a percentage of income has actually gone down. It's got a little blip now. It's up to, I think, between 13 and 14% now in the US. So that has started to change. But even with lower prices for food, more than 1 billion people can't afford food today. And the irony is that half of farm families can't feed themselves. If you look at where the poverty is, where the malnutrition and stunting are, it's in farming areas. It's small farmers, in fact. That's not something we want to maintain. That's something we want to alleviate. We want to remove. That's, in fact, part of what China is trying to do. And yet, one of the things that we're finding is that we're not covering the true cost of producing food today. So if you just take water as an example, and these 4 specific commodities from a t-shirt to a soda to cheese to a quarter pounder, if you take the amount of product that it takes at farm gate to produce that product, you look at how much water it took to grow that, and again, whether it's irrigated or rain-fed, we're not distinguishing here. And then you divide those last 2, what a farmer was paid versus that water. If a farmer paid a decent price for water, all the money they make from selling a product would be used. So as we bring externalities into pricing, whether it's soil erosion, whether it's other kinds of things, greenhouse gas emissions, etc., it's going to have an impact on prices. In the case of water alone, it could double prices unless we get innovative and find other ways to produce more with less. So where are the biggest agricultural subsidies? Well, traditionally people would say it's the EU or the US. The US's subsidies are pretty far down now because the price of commodities have been high recently. The EU's subsidies are still relatively high because they're paying for a standard of living rather than a commodity-based type of system. But the real sleeper is in the last 5 to 10 years, the BRICS have been increasing subsidies phenomenally. And China's subsidies per year are estimated to be almost twice what the US and EU are combined. Brazil doubled its subsidies in the last 3 years. Not a lot, from 5 billion to 10 billion, but still not insignificant either. But the biggest subsidy of all is not these. If you take all the subsidies of governments and add them together, and probably multiply them by some large number, you finally get at what we would call the subsidy from nature. Those externalities that are not yet included in pricing, but on a scarce planet are going to have to be if we're going to move forward with sustainability. Now, let's look at land. Logically, if we double food production in the next 37 years, and we don't change anything, it's business as usual, we would double the amount of land needed. Now we're assuming there's going to be changes, but just look at that on the face of it. From 33%, and in fact this is the low estimate, the higher estimate that's kind of common now is 40%. So from 66 to 80% of the planet would be farmed or ranched. But let's look at what the planet is. 5% of the terrestrial area is desert. About 18% are mountains, lakes, rivers, and streams. About 2% are infrastructure and cities. About 12% are parks. And that doesn't leave us very much land to expand onto, and that would mean the entire planet would be cultivated at some level. In fact, we're beginning to see a number of countries, about 100 in the last 23 years, have taken land out of protection or downgraded those areas of protection in order to get at the resources there. So this means taking land out of national parks. It means degazetting or undermining classifications. And this probably, more than any other slide, is why somebody from an environmental organization is here today talking about food. This is a trend we would like to stop. And the only way we think we're going to be able to stop that is to work with industry to figure out how to intensify and how to do it efficiently and more sustainably. But we've got to freeze the footprint of food. We've got to stop in terms of expansion of the land. We've got to reduce the amount of water we're using, etc., or we're not going to be able to have enough food production and still have biodiversity and viable ecosystem services on the planet. These are the 35 places that we think are the most important to make sure they survive up through 2050. We did a survey to look at what the most important threats to these places are, and we found that it was actually 15 commodities. And it's a mix of forest, ag, ranching, wild-caught, and aquaculture. But there's 15 of them. These are the ones where there's the most expansion of production, most expansion of consumption, etc. But just to put it in context, these are the ones where China is playing a large role in either the production or the trade. And these are the ones where India is playing a large role. And you begin to see that the world is different than we had thought. It's forced us to change our strategies from focusing mostly on companies in North America and Europe to looking at how we pivot and focus on companies in China and India and other BRICS where both production and consumption are increasing more rapidly. So by 2050, 9 billion people, twice as much food. And whether it's 70% or 110% of actual food consumption increases we need, by the time you throw in bioplastics and biofuels that feed and other things, we're getting to doubling relatively easily. The issue, though, is on a finite planet, should consumers have a choice about whether they buy sustainable products or not? Or should all the products on the shelf be sustainable? And if you think it's the latter, then the question is, how do we create those systems where sustainability is the norm, not the niche anymore? We think that there are probably 9 ways that we can increase food production on the planet. None of them by themselves will double food production by 2050. If we work on all of them, we could probably quadruple food production by 2050. So we have it within our grasp to actually produce more with less, but we've got to get started on it. I want to talk just about a few of them. There's a rather long paper for those of you who like to read that I can send anybody who wants to see it to go into more details about each of these. We waste 1 in 3 calories. And by waste, I mean waste. We don't eat it, we don't feed it, and we don't use it to fuel our cars. It's simply wasted. Now, 1 in 3 calories, or 30 to 40%, is true of developing countries, and it's true of developed countries. But the bigger issue I think, is what else that waste represents, looking at kind of optimal solutions and not focusing just on one thing. Agriculture represents 30 to 35% of all greenhouse gas emissions. One-third, or 1 in 3 calories being wasted, means that 10% of all greenhouse gas emissions are related to food production where the food is not even consumed. That is what I would call low-hanging fruit and a win-win kind of situation. 23% of all the water used by people on this planet is embedded in that food waste, just the waste part. You begin to see how these issues relate to each other. I did a little experiment with my staff. I sent each of them to a grocery store to find what was said on products about sell by, use by, destroy by, etc. We came back with 56 things in less than an hour. And I thought the most honest was, use this product by X so that you can buy more. We need to get this fixed. We need to have standard language that actually means something to consumers, because right now it's confusing. And if you go into any home, people throw food away because they simply don't know. So we've got to have a better system for how to learn more about this. We also can't take genetics off the table. Without genetics, without animal and plant breeding, we'd be hunters and gatherers, and we wouldn't have rooms like this, we wouldn't have cities like these, we wouldn't have accumulated wealth and been able to diversify our economies without basic genetics. So it's not a question of if genetics, it's a question of which genetics. And different countries are going to have different views on this. In my own organization, this has been a hotly contested issue because we're a global organization with many offices in Europe and elsewhere who are opposed to GMOs. But what we found, if you look at GMOs as one of the potential threats to the environment, it's not even in the top 6 or 10 in terms of real issues like deforestation, climate change, ocean acidification, species loss, etc., soil erosion. This is not in the top tier of things we need to be worried about. But there's a lot more than just GMOs that are interesting from a genetics point of view. In the US, we quadrupled corn production with hybrids. And now, using marker-assisted breeding, we can actually do even more with hybrids. We can find and select traits within corn that are actually giving us more productivity, etc. Most of the world's farmers who grow corn don't use hybrids. So there's tremendous gains to be made with what we already have, and we need to think about how we would focus on that. But we also need to look at which crops give us more calories. If we want to feed the planet, and again, calories isn't the only thing we need to focus on, we need to focus on nutrients. But let's just start with the basic calories. Corn in Iowa, which is arguably one of the most productive places for corn on the planet, produces 5% as many calories as bananas in Costa Rica on an annual basis. And sugar in Brazil produces 60 times more calories per acre than corn in Iowa. So why all the focus on corn? If we want to feed the planet, maybe we should figure out how to put more nutrients into some crops that are already more productive, rather than try to figure out how to make crops that are less productive more productive. Just something worth thinking about. We also might want to focus on the crops that are the most important in the places where population and consumption and income are going to increase the fastest. In Africa, these are crops that you'd want to look at. They've never really benefited from modern genetics, from modern plant breeding. What would happen if we started looking at these crops? Mars has begun to look at cocoa because cocoa is one of those crops where we've got about 7-8 million hectares of cocoa globally. Most of the trees are in the 35 to 40-year-old range, which is too old. They need to be replanted. How do you do that without going out and cutting another 7 to 8 million hectares of forest, which was the old way of planting cocoa? So Mars actually found that 20% of the plants in any plantation produced 80% of the crop. So I said, okay, let's map the genome of the cocoa plant, find out why those 20% produce so much, select those traits, and make it so we can produce 3 to 4 times as much crop on 40 to 50% as much land. And that's what they did. They mapped the genome of cocoa, put it in the public domain for every plant breeder to have access to, and figured out a way to graft new planting materials onto 35 and 40-year-old rootstocks. That's an interesting solution that will quadruple production on half the land. Agriculture uses 70% of all the water on the planet today. What that comes to, roughly, is 1 liter of water per 1 calorie of food. Going forward, we're going to have to figure out how to use half a liter to produce 2 calories. Every system, whether it's animal protein, plant crops, etc., is going to have to figure out how to do that. We also know that better practices are up to 100 times better than worse ones. And even in places like northeast Nebraska, you find some corn farmers that are 10 times more efficient about nitrogen use, water use, etc., than their neighbors. So this isn't an issue that's just halfway around the world, comparisons of a relative productive economy versus a less productive one. But I guess the question that I would ask you today is, which is going to give us more food? Making the best producers a little bit better, recognizing them in whatever way, or working with them, or moving the rest of producers? Let me show you what I mean. Most certification programs, verification programs, want to reward better producers. They want to reward performance. They want to help show that this crop is better, it produces, it has productivity that is based on fewer impacts, more production, less soil erosion, etc. The problem is the bottom 25% of producers actually cause about 50% of the impacts that we care about, and they only produce about 10% of the product. So if you really wanted to increase food production, do you focus on the top, or do you focus on the bottom? If you really want to reduce impacts, do you focus on the top, or do you focus on the bottom? We care about certain crops because of their impacts. Our solutions need to be targeting those impacts and reducing them. And you do that by working with the people at the bottom, not at the top. Maybe it's a stepwise approach. Maybe it's finding another way for them to make a living. Maybe they don't have the resource base to actually produce efficiently. We've got to begin to look at all those issues in order to shift this performance curve. If we have to have a 60% improvement, then we're going to have to figure out how to do that. We can also rebuild soils. We need to turn the expanding agricultural frontier on itself. We need to turn it back on itself. We need to take degraded and underperforming land and rebuild productivity. We've got a project with the World Bank where we want to do this with about 250 million hectares. We think this is going to sequester or have an avoidance of 2 to 5 gigatons of carbon a year, be responsible for about 10% of global calories each year. It'll cost about $10 billion, about half from governments around smallholders and small producers, and about half from commercial banks, because it's going to be economically viable for companies to do it. But the real kicker is that today, because so many companies are concerned about their supply chains, we've got about $25 billion in long-term contracts that can be used to help producers walk into banks and get money to make this happen. That's never existed before. We now have partnerships between producers and their buyers, as opposed to adversarial relationships like we've had for so long. And in Brazil, just to make a long story short, farmers who are improving productivity, improving soil carbon through no-till are making more money growing soil each year than they are growing soybeans, because the average price of their land increases by almost what they pay for it when they buy degraded land, each and every year for the next 5 or 6 years. This is the areas of the world where there are degraded lands. So we're going to be starting with Brazil, Argentina, Indonesia, and probably West Africa around this cocoa and coffee area that I was referring to before. But the big question is, how do we move sustainability from niche markets like organic and other types of certified products to the new norm? How is sustainability going to become every product on the shelf rather than just one? And I want to talk about 4 different strategies or platforms that have been created recently. Unilever has decided to go all in on this issue. And they've said that 100% of all their bio-based raw materials, that's 3,300 to 3,500 raw materials in any given year that they purchase, will be sourced sustainably by 2020. They're about 30% of the way there. They didn't have a clue how they were going to do it when they started, but they said it's better to fail at a 100% goal than to achieve a 50% goal. The Consumer Goods Forum, a $3 trillion association of retailers and brands, has recently made a commitment to take deforestation out of their supply chains. 18 companies signed on initially, 57 have signed on since then. The goal is to do this by 2020. They're focused on 4 commodities in 2 countries, which represent half of deforestation globally. The reason deforestation is interesting here is because deforestation is equal to, from a greenhouse gas point of view, all the emissions of all transportation systems on the planet each year. So a reduction by half through what these companies can leverage in their markets is a huge contribution. The third platform is the first sector that I'm aware of that's made a commitment to third-party verification of sustainability, and this is with salmon aquaculture. The CEOs in August of 15 salmon aquaculture producing companies agreed that by 2020 they would be 100% certified by the ASC, an Aquaculture Stewardship Council standard. They represent 70% of global production. And they did it because they realized that the reputation of any one company was affecting the reputation of the entire sector. They needed to move the entire sector forward, not only to have market access, but also have license to operate in the places they wanted to produce, especially if they want to double, triple, quadruple production. How they agreed to do this is amazing. They've created a database to actually share information on how to improve. What are the better practices about escapes, about sea lice, about other kinds of issues? Feed conversion. What's the investment required? What's the payback period? Which things fail? Which things succeed? So that they can all learn faster as a sector. And that's how they got the buy-in of the poorer performing companies, because the better performing companies agreed to share their information. Sustainability for that group is pre-competitive. How they market their products, who they sell to, how they package them, how they process them is competitive. How they produce them is pre-competitive. And this is perhaps even more interesting, especially in an age where many governments have been absent without leave. In Ireland, in early August or October, the government has committed to 100% third-party certified exports of all food by 2016. And they're about 30% of the way there now. The only way this is going to happen is when governments, the private sector, and producers work together to share information. But for them, it was about reputation more than premiums. They're not doing it because they expect to get a premium. They're doing it because they want to maintain market access and increase it as well. Now, why are companies beginning to focus on these kinds of issues? There's been a real shift in the value of companies. In 1975, the S&P 500, more than 80% of the value was in their tangible assets. So things like factories and fleets and material things that you could actually insure against flooding or against hurricanes or against fire. By 2009, more than 80% of the value of companies was intangible. It was about brands, it was about reputations. How do you insure your company around those kinds of risks? Well, one of the ways is through third-party certification programs. But that's why we're beginning to see a lot of move along those areas. And we're also beginning to see that there is a fair amount of illegality involved in the global trading system. So products can be purchased legally, they can be exported legally, but how they were produced was not in compliance with the laws of the country they were produced in. Whether it's about the right concessions, the right access to the resource, whether it's about labor laws, all those, or products that could be used, pesticides, etc., that's where there's a fairly significant disjoint. In fact, we've done some research now across these different sectors, and it shows that between 5 and 25% of exports are not produced legally, even if they're exported legally. This is a huge reputational risk, and why a lot of the major food companies, the retailers and brands, are beginning to shift to certified products. And then let's look at animal protein trends, which is where this actually probably relates more to you guys. As we shift from 10 to 20% of global calories coming from animal protein, and we're at about 13 to 14% now, we need to double the amount of cereal grains produced, or feed grains produced for feed. As countries like India and China begin to consume more animal protein, we have a lot more consumption, not of the same things. It's each country, as they get more income, consumes different things. Like India is beginning to corner the market on eggs because that's something culturally a lot of Hindus will eat that wouldn't eat meat of any kind. We're also seeing trends in productions and shifts from selling feed grains and ingredients to selling animal protein. In fact, we've put together a proposal that Hank Paulson has carried to the Premier of China, looking at the environmental impacts of China feeding so many animals on its coastal marine resources, including aquaculture, and it's costing billions of dollars a year because of red tides. It would make more sense for China, as they begin to make their strategy more coherent, to start importing meat and not import grains. And those kinds of things, I think, are beginning to carry the day. There was a discussion earlier that aquaculture had surpassed wild-caught fish, and that happened in the early 2000s. But 2 years ago, aquaculture surpassed beef production globally for the first time ever, and has widened the gap since. That is some of the trends in animal protein production and consumption. Most aquacultured species today, the carps, the bivalves, the seaweed, etc., do not get fed at all, or get fed fertilizer to increase plankton and phytoplankton growth. But this is a variation on a slide Eric showed, and basically it's looking at global protein consumption, terrestrial protein consumption, versus arable land. And this probably, as well as any other slide, illustrates why we need to shift and become much more efficient, because we have less land per person and we're trying to produce more protein. It argues for intensification. The question is, how do you measure? And I think there's a lot of people in this audience, but also elsewhere, that are thinking about what are the right metrics for sustainability? What are the right metrics to compare different kinds of animal protein? Here are a few that we've been thinking about. There's by no means, these are not prioritized, and the list is certainly not all-inclusive, but protein in, protein out is a kind of obvious one. How much land does it take to produce a gram of protein, or a kilo, etc.? What are the greenhouse gas emissions per gram of protein? What's the feed conversion ratio per gram of protein? And what is the time to produce a gram of protein? And can you produce multiple grams of protein throughout a year on the same land, etc.? This is getting at how we optimize rather than how we choose just one of these metrics. Maybe the one that's not there that we should say is how many grams of protein are produced, or how many kilos of soil erosion are associated with each gram of protein produced. That might be a fundamentally more important one. And then this takes some of those same issues and tries to look at it at different species, because ultimately people are going to start comparing. If these are about resources, how do we use our resources more efficiently? And with the exception of beef, you'll see that some of these other animal proteins are better in some categories, worse in the others. That's interesting to know. That's the kind of optimal kind of solution, the trade-off issue that we need to know more about in order to manage the planet. I'm not putting these up there as the written in stone kind of way that we need to approach this, but this is how we need to begin to think about these issues. The big issue, though, is that inefficiency increases the environmental impacts. And what I'm talking about here is net. So farmers talk about productivity per hectare of land, but maybe the issue, if you look at it from a waste point of view, is productivity per unit of consumption. And then we're automatically going to have 35 to 40% wasted. That affects the net consumption. So that affects feed conversion ratios and kind of feed nutrition issues affect productivity, affect the impact. Morbidity and mortality, parasites, all those different things affect the efficiency with which we're using the world's finite resources. And this just shows in the last 40 or so years how we've been doing with beef in the US. We've increased productivity, reduced the number of animals, reduced the amount of feed used, the water used, the amount of land used. That's all good, and that's had implications around other things like greenhouse gases, from manure to methane to nitrous oxide, etc. We've actually improved performance in all of those things. We have intensified beef production. We're producing more with less, with fewer impacts. Some other countries like Brazil have done a lot less. They've extensified much of their production through the expansion of ranching into the Amazon and the clearing of forest. Those are the systems we need to think about carefully. And just one final point here to get to that awareness issue and to build consensus and be strategic. This is an issue that we have got to start getting involved in and to create a platform for which is better. Does stocking density, is that actually the best measure of animal welfare? Is free range actually the best measure of animal welfare? These are things that we need to think about. In our aquaculture work, we've had to try to figure out what are the animal welfare types of measures we would want to look at, and this is a whole list of ones that we've come up with. We think any one of these is probably better than stocking density. Combined, they're probably much better as an index for animal welfare. But again, we need to change the way we think about this. I grew up in Missouri. We had a saying there, and it goes, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. We've got to double food production by 2050. Everyone in this room can do something about that. Nobody in this room is going to address all the different issues. But we've all got to figure out how we can do more with less. Think about it. Thank you. I think we have some time now for questions. And thanks for the water.
Thanks a lot, Jason. Thank you very much. Outstanding. Any questions for Jason here? We get already the first question.
Yes, sir. Who are the independent third-party people that provide the certification, and who writes those standards? You know, in our country, it'd be a big difference if the national pork producers write them as opposed to the HSUS writing them.
Right.
So who provides those standards for the third-party certification?
So globally credible standards are based on science, and they're based on multi-stakeholder groups. The salmon group that I just said has now moved towards accepting certification as their way forward. Those salmon producers, along with NGOs, along with government officials, along with retailers and brands, along with researchers and scientists, were involved in an 8-year process to develop the standards that they have committed to. So they're all involved in them. Right now we're doing global beef standards, and the interpretation of that in the US, NCBA is involved in. In dairy work, we're working with the Dairy Marketing Institute. They are involved, but they don't write the standards themselves. Other people need to be at the table as well in order to build that kind of awareness and then consensus. But I would say that one of the issues that comes out of these standard setting processes is that the NGOs get brought up to speed pretty fast about the realities of production and about what is actually existing today versus what they might have thought was existing. And that is a real benefit to these processes when the producers agree that it's important enough to take the time to educate them.
We had a question over there.
On one of the slides you're showing the efficiencies of protein production comparing beef with chicken and pork. I don't know why you left out milk production. I believe some 40 years ago, Dr. Reed from Cornell University gave a paper or wrote a paper showing milk production probably as the most efficient animal protein and calorie production.
That's true. And I actually audited a course at Cornell about 40 years ago on that. So that was inadvertent, it wasn't intentional. And milk is the most efficient way by many parameters for producing protein.
You talked about declassification of
There's
farms.
a question.
Can we have a mic so everybody can hear?
You talked about declassification of parks. Has any of that ever been in the United States and gone back to agriculture? I'm sure in the European countries they might do it, but have we done any of that in the U.S.?
You know, I think in the U.S. the declassification is more towards urbanization and roads and those types of land use. In fact, we've had a de facto reforestation of the eastern half of the United States that has happened over the last 100 years. If you were in New England in 1850 or so, 80 to 90% of every state was cut, was cleared, and was used for pasture or farming. Now it's just the opposite, 80 or 90% is forested. And Europe is relatively similar to that. But what we're finding is that protection in other parts of the world is a lot less meaningful, I guess is the right term. And so when there is demand for more food or access to land to farm, governments are more willing to open those places up because trees don't have standing. Trees can't go to court the same way that people can to get those areas opened up, and they don't have the same persuasion in government that people do. So the issue isn't to try to figure out how to address that confrontation between biodiversity and people. The issue is how to head it off ahead of time and produce more so that we don't actually have that conflict exist. And that conflict, will inevitably exist, but can we keep it down to a minimum so that we can make more informed choices both about where we produce and how we produce, as well as where we protect and how we protect.
There's a question over there.
The runner's going to get the exercise.
I was just wondering if you thought there was a relevant distinction between a need for food or a consumer demand for food. Is there one that is an obligation you have to feed the world, and is one an opportunity for just profit? Is there a distinction between, like I said, a need and a demand?
Well, I don't know if this answers your question, but let me just put this in a slightly different way. There's about 160 million children that are stunted today. And that means that in the first 3 years of their lives, they're not getting the nutrients they need to develop their brains fully. So that after that 3 years, they will never have the brain function that they were born with, because it didn't develop or it atrophied. To me, there is an obligation to not have that exist on this planet. There is an ethical issue around that. And chronic malnutrition is just a variation of that. It's an extension of that. Why it's so important to me personally is both, well, to me is both personal and kind of professional. At a personal level, I grew up in the US on a very small farm on less than $1 a day for 15 years. We grew our own food. I hunted 3 days a week. We had plenty of food, so we didn't have stunting in my family, but we could have very easily. I think somebody recently wrote about this as the ovarian lottery. It depends on which family you're born into as to whether a child has a chance or not. The professional issue that I have with this, though, is that we have a lot of problems that we're confronting. And we heard in the first presentation that we really need to be much more, we need much more innovation. I don't think innovation just comes from children born in wealthier families. I think it can come from anywhere. I think good brains happen everywhere. We're taking, in the US, about 50% of the population out of the solutions category and putting them into the problems category by not having more opportunities for people. Globally, I'd say we're taking 90% off the table as part of the solution. We can't afford to do that as a society or as a group, a species trying to manage this planet sustainably. We've got to use all the resources we've got. So for me, at a very fundamental level, this is about putting the best brains to work to solve problems.
There's a question over there.
You mentioned 50%, I think, were farmers that were below. Can we not teach them to do a better job to feed themselves?
So that's clearly part of it. It's very hard for a person with less than 3 acres of land to produce commodities and make a living. And nearly all of them need to be need to have off-farm income, either part of the year by seasonal migrations, by spouses working, by selling other things, making handicrafts. There's a lot of different things going on, but the point is the farm itself doesn't generate enough. And that's just with the kids that stay. You know, half to 2/3 of kids leave farming areas to go to cities. So even just with the ones that are trying to maintain the farm, we're having a gradual reduction of farm size. If they were close to cities, if they had infrastructure, they could sell vegetables, they could sell fruits, they could sell value-added kinds of products. But competing with soybeans, with sugarcane, with beef, with things that are dominated by, that have an efficiency of scale that they just can't achieve, it's going to be very hard for them to just learn enough to get better. And here's the other issue. If we increase productivity 5%, if we increased prices to these producers 5%, in the grand scheme of things, that wouldn't really make a difference. That's just not enough. The problem is too big. So I think we need to separate solutions aimed at trying to produce more and solutions that are based on trying to make sure that everybody has access to food. Keeping small farmers as small farmers is not something that I would argue for. That's kicking the can forward. That's maintaining poverty. Nobody wants to be part of maintaining poverty as a strategy.
I just want to follow up for that. You talked about them not having enough nutrition. Can they not feed themselves better? I'm not talking about commercialization.
Right.
I'm talking, when you were young, what'd you do? You went out and hunted. You
Right.
made sure you had enough food. Can they not first feed themselves
So,
and find a way to do that?
right. So
Help
basically,
them do that?
what helped me was an education. What helped me actually was the space program and an emphasis on math and science across the United States in all the schools. But this was the 50s and 60s, and a lot of those programs are gone now. So in their case, I would say they can't live just with nutrients. They've also got to cover school fees, they've got to cover weddings, they've got to cover funerals and health, and they need flip-flops, and oh, by the way, they buy metal pans to cook with. They can't live just a subsistence life. Nobody in the world today just has a subsistence life, so they can't just produce what they need to eat. Many more of them could do that, but then their kids would never get an education. And if you ask any of these small farmers whether they want their kids to farm or not, 99% will say no. They want them to have a better life. So that's why they're making these sacrifices, to try to get them in schools, keep them in schools, get them further than anybody else in the family has gone before.
We have time for one more question. There's one here.
How do you see the people in the United States allowing agriculture to get the water that it needs to increase the capacity that you're talking about?
Well, I think everybody's going to have to pay more for water. I think if you start pricing water, everybody's going to use it more efficiently as well. My concern is that we could get water priced well in the United States, and that would lead to actually the import of products produced in places where water isn't priced well, and therefore it's cheaper to actually produce crops and ship them to us. So we need to begin to think about how we manage the planet now, not how we just manage a piece of it. And that's in some ways the limitations of governments that focus just on their piece of the planet. We need, and this is really, I think, where companies are beginning to get it right. They're beginning to see supply chain management as something they have to do globally. They can't just do it in one part of the world or another. But in the US, the price for water is going to have to go up. And it's the same around water and a child as it is around a tree and a child. If a child needs water, agriculture is going to lose the right to that water. We're going to make that choice, and then we're going to have to figure out how to live with the consequences. So I think we need to try to prevent that choice from becoming the norm by becoming more efficient with how we use water, by recycling, by finding other ways to use water, etc.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.